A rainy Manhattan afternoon, a crowded diner, a woman sitting across from the man who spent 7 years making her feel like nothing. And now he has her wrist in his hand under the table, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises, smiling for anyone who happens to glance over. He leans in and speaks quietly in Italian, convinced no one in this city understands a word. He is wrong. At the booth behind him, a man in a tailored suit slowly sets down his espresso cup, and the most dangerous person in New York begins to stand up. If this story has you hooked already, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels. Stay until the very end. You will not regret it. The rain had been falling since morning, the kind of cold, indifferent Manhattan rain that turned the sidewalks gray and made everyone move faster than usual, heads down, collars up, pretending the city wasn't quietly grinding them into dust. Evelyn Rhodes had been sitting in the corner booth of Carmine's Diner on West 46th Street for 11 minutes before Travis arrived, and in those 11 minutes she had already rehearsed the conversation 17 times in her head. She knew every version of it. She had lived through enough versions of it over the past 7 years to know exactly how each one ended. None of them ended well. She had chosen the diner deliberately, public, busy, loud enough that raised voices would be absorbed into the general noise, bright enough that she could see every exit from where she sat. Her attorney had advised her not to meet him at all, had told her in plain language that direct contact during active divorce proceedings was exactly the kind of situation that gave men like Travis Holden leverage they didn't deserve. But the papers needed signatures. The settlement required his initials on 4 separate pages, and Travis had made it clear through his own attorney's clipped and carefully worded message that he would only sign in person. No lawyers present, just the two of them. Her attorney had said absolutely not. Evelyn had said, fine, I'll handle it. That was the thing nobody understood about surviving someone like Travis. You didn't survive by following the safe path every time. Sometimes the safe path was the one that left you waiting forever, suspended in the specific purgatory of a life that was almost over, but not quite. Sometimes you had to walk into the room and look the damage directly in the face. She had ordered coffee she didn't want, and a slice of apple pie she had no intention of eating. She needed something to do with her hands. She needed to look like a woman who was relaxed, who had nothing to fear, who had simply stopped by for a midday meal and happened to be bringing divorce papers in her leather portfolio case. She needed to look like someone Travis couldn't crack open in 30 seconds flat. The bell above the diner door rang at 12:17 p.m. Travis Holden was 6 feet 1 inch tall, with the kind of build that came from obsessive gym routines rather than physical labor, and he dressed the way men dressed when they wanted other men to take them seriously. Dark wool coat, sharp collar, shoes that cost more than most people's rent. He was 41 years old and still handsome in the way that certain dangerous things were handsome. Clean lines, no visible damage, everything underneath carefully hidden. He moved through the diner the way he moved through every room, like he was doing the room a favor by entering it. He spotted her immediately. Of course he did. He had always been able to find her. He slid into the seat across from her without removing his coat, without saying hello. He picked up the laminated menu, scanned it for exactly 3 seconds, and set it back down. Then he looked at her, that particular look she had learned to read the way sailors read weather. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was assessment. He was measuring the distance between who she was now and who he had spent years trying to turn her into. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not sleeping." "Travis, I didn't come here to discuss how I look." He smiled at that. A small, controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. He turned slightly in his seat and signaled the waitress with the casual authority of a man who expected to be noticed. He ordered black coffee. He didn't ask Evelyn if she wanted anything. He never asked. That had always been one of the smaller details she used to excuse, used to file under quirks, under confidence, under the 1,000 tiny justifications you built up around a person before you understood what you were actually building. She placed the portfolio on the table between them. 4 signatures, she said. Page 3, page 7, page 11, and the final page, dated today. That's all I need. Travis looked at the portfolio the way he looked at everything she initiated, with the particular brand of contempt that masquerades as patience. "Sit with it for a second," he said. "I've been sitting with it for 18 months. Evelyn. Her name in his mouth still did something to her nervous system that she hated herself for. Not longing. She was well past longing. It was more like the physical memory of impact, the body remembering danger even when the mind had already decided to move forward. The property on Riverside, he said. We need to talk about it. There's nothing to talk about. The judge ruled on incomplete information. His voice stayed level. That was the thing about Travis in public. He was always level, always calm. The version of him that existed in front of other people was so reasonable, so measured, that she used to wonder sometimes if she had invented the other one. My attorney is filing a motion to revisit the valuation. If you sign those papers today, you're signing under terms that are about to change. Your attorney has been threatening that motion for 4 months. This time it's filed. She met his eyes. Then my attorney will respond to it. Sign the papers, Travis. He leaned back. He looked out the rain-streaked window at the street. He was quiet for long enough that the waitress came with his coffee, set it down, and retreated without making eye contact, the way people learn to retreat from certain tables. You know what your problem is? He said finally, his voice still easy, still conversational. You've always confused stubbornness with strength. They're not the same thing. Sign the papers. You've got nobody in your corner. You know that, right? That attorney of yours is billing you $300 an hour to lose. Your clients are drying up because nobody in this city wants to hire someone who's publicly in the middle of a messy divorce. Your savings are gone. He paused. How long are you planning to hold out? It was a practiced recitation. She recognized every item on the list because he had assembled it carefully over months, feeding each piece of information back to her like a form of slow starvation, making sure she knew exactly how small her world had become, making sure she understood that he was the only thing that had ever made it larger. Sign the papers, she said for the third time. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Something shifted behind his eyes. He reached under the table. She felt his hand close around her wrist, her right wrist, her drawing hand. And the grip was not violent, not the way anyone watching from across the room would have categorized it as violent. It was precise. It was the grip of someone who had learned exactly how much pressure communicated the message without leaving marks in visible places. He held her wrist against the edge of the table and he leaned forward slightly, and his expression never changed. Stop performing, he said quietly. And then, with a fluency and ease that told her he had rehearsed this too, he switched to Italian. She had taken 2 semesters of Italian in college and remembered almost none of it, but she heard the word sparire, disappear, and she heard the word arrangerò, which she thought meant arrange. She heard him use the word documento, and she heard freno, which she was fairly certain meant brakes. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. Her pulse spiked so hard she felt it in her teeth. Travis smiled pleasantly for the benefit of anyone looking. His thumb pressed down on the inside of her wrist, the specific point above the pulse, the one that sent white sparks up her forearm. He kept speaking in Italian, low and unhurried, the way a man spoke when he was absolutely certain no one could hear him. And then, from the booth directly behind Travis, came a sound, the soft, deliberate placement of a ceramic espresso cup on a saucer. Neither of them had noticed him. Evelyn's entire awareness had been fixed on Travis, on the exit signs, on the script she'd rehearsed, and Travis never noticed anyone who wasn't directly useful to him. But someone had been sitting in the booth behind Travis for the entire duration of their conversation, and that someone now set down his cup with the particular precision of a man who had just decided that the time for sitting quietly was over. Travis continued speaking in Italian. The man in the booth behind him said, in Italian, without raising his voice, Stai descrivendo come manomettere I freni di una donna e farla sparire. L'ho sentito tutto. You are describing how to tamper with a woman's brakes and make her disappear. I heard all of it. Travis's grip on Evelyn's wrist went slack. He turned in his seat slowly, the way you turned when something in your animal brain was already telling you that turning was a mistake. The man who had spoken was standing now, having risen from the booth with the unhurried ease of someone who stood up because he chose to, not because anything required it. He was perhaps 45, with dark hair going silver at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than Travis's entire outfit put together, but wearing it the way men wore suits when the suit was incidental, when what they were actually dressed in was authority. He was not especially large. He didn't need to be. There was something about the way he occupied space, the absolute stillness, the quality of attention in his dark eyes, that made the surrounding area feel smaller. He reached up with one hand and removed his suit jacket. Beneath it, he wore a shoulder holster. Empty, but present. A statement. He folded the jacket over one arm. "Travis Holden," the man said in English, his accent faintly Italian, mostly New York. "I know who you are. I know the property attorneys you use. I know the judge you've been quietly entertaining at your club on 54th Street. I know about the motion your firm filed this morning, and I know it will be withdrawn by the end of the business day, because the attorney who filed it is going to have a very difficult afternoon." Travis had gone the color of uncooked dough. "Who are you?" he said. "You already know," the man said. "That's why you're sitting very still." He was right. Evelyn watched Travis's face go through something she had never seen on it before. Not anger, not calculation, not the cold confidence that had defined him for as long as she'd known him. What moved across his face in the space of 3 seconds was something much simpler and much more unfamiliar. Fear. "I don't want any," Travis started. "You want to finish that sentence very carefully." Silence. The diner had not gone completely quiet. People were still eating, still talking at nearby tables, still sending the half-aware glances of New Yorkers trained to be professionally oblivious. But the waitress had stopped moving. The man behind the counter had found something extremely important to look at on the far wall. The 2 men in the booth nearest the window were suddenly very still over their sandwiches. "She signs nothing today," the man said. "Whatever you drove here to accomplish ends in the next 30 seconds. You walk out that door, you get in whatever car is waiting for you, and you have your attorney's office call hers before 4 o'clock to confirm the motion is dead. If the call doesn't come by 4, I'll know by 4:01. And then we'll have a different conversation, one that won't take place in public." Travis looked at Evelyn. She realized she was looking back at him with an expression she had never been able to manage in 7 years of marriage. Absolute calm. Not performance. Actual calm. Because the fear that had lived in her chest since the moment he had walked through that door had, in the last 90 seconds, been replaced by something she couldn't entirely name. Travis stood up. He buttoned his coat. He picked up his phone from the table. He did not look at the man who had just spoken to him, could not, Evelyn realized, bring himself to make eye contact again. He looked at Evelyn instead, and what was in his face now was the purest version of what had always been there, the thing that had taken her years to identify correctly. Not love, not even possession, but the rage of a man who had lost an object he believed was his. "This isn't finished," he said to her. "Yes," the man said, "it is." Travis walked out. The bell above the door rang. The diner exhaled. Evelyn became aware, incrementally, that her hands were shaking. Not violently. A fine tremor, the kind that lived just below the surface and only showed if you looked directly at your own fingers and realized they weren't quite steady. She pressed them flat against the table. She breathed in through her nose, counted to 4, breathed out. The man picked up his espresso cup from the next booth, crossed the narrow aisle between the tables, and stood at the edge of hers. "May I?" he said, gesturing at the seat Travis had just vacated. She looked up at him. Up close, the stillness was even more pronounced. Not the stillness of a man suppressing something, but the stillness of a man who had nothing left to suppress, who had arrived at some internal resolution so complete that agitation had simply become irrelevant. There were lines around his eyes that suggested either too much sun or too much insomnia, possibly both. His hands, wrapped around the small espresso cup, were steady in a way that made her own unsteady hands feel like an announcement. "I don't know who you are," she said. "I know. You just—" She stopped, pressed her palms harder against the table. "What you said to him." In Italian. "He was describing specific plans," the man said simply. "I don't like that kind of conversation taking place near me." "How much did you hear?" "Enough." She stared at him. "Are you going to tell me your name?" He set the espresso cup on her table, pulled out the chair, and sat. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested every action was intentional, nothing wasted, nothing performed. "Damien DeLuca," he said. She knew the name, not intimately. She didn't run in those circles, had never wanted to, had spent her professional life working hard enough to orbit respectable money rather than the other kind. But Manhattan was a city where certain names moved differently than other names, where they carried weight in conversations the way certain weather systems carried pressure. You felt them before they arrived, and you felt them after they had passed. DeLuca was one of those names. She had heard it attached to buildings, to disappearances, to the kind of legal settlements that never saw a courtroom. She understood now why Travis had gone the color he'd gone. "I don't need," she started. "You need to eat something," he said, looking at the untouched apple pie. "Or at least stop pretending you were going to." Despite everything, the shaking hands, the adrenaline still burning through her bloodstream, the absolute unreality of the last 4 minutes, something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Something smaller than that. The beginning of a breath she hadn't taken in a very long time. "I don't know why you helped me," she said. "I heard something I didn't like. I said something about it." He lifted one shoulder slightly. "That's the entire story. Men like you don't get involved in strangers' arguments in diners." "Men like me," he repeated, with a precision that suggested he was filing the phrase somewhere. "You know what kind of man I am from a name. From a name and from the way Travis looked at you." He considered that. He didn't argue it. "The motion his attorney filed this morning," she said. "You said it would be withdrawn. Can you actually do that?" "I said what I intended to happen, yes." "Why?" He looked at her directly, and she had the sudden and specific sensation of being actually seen, not evaluated, not measured, not assessed for usefulness. Seen. It was such an unfamiliar sensation that it produced a physical response, a tightening in her chest that she chose, consciously, to classify as discomfort. "Because you sat in this booth for 11 minutes before he arrived," Damien said, "and in 11 minutes, you reorganized everything in front of you 4 separate times. The fork, the napkin, the portfolio, the coffee cup, 4 times. And every time you finished, you looked at the door." He paused. "I've seen that kind of waiting before. I don't like it." She didn't know what to say to that. He reached into his interior jacket pocket, the jacket now folded over the back of his chair, and produced a card. Plain matte cardstock, dark gray, with a phone number in clean type and nothing else. No name. No title. "If he contacts you again before the motion is withdrawn," he said, "call that number." She looked at the card. She looked at him. "And if I don't want to call it, then don't." He stood. He picked up his jacket, shrugged it back on with the same economy of motion that characterized everything he did. Then he reached up and unwound the scarf from around his neck, dark wool, expensive. And before she could process what he was doing, he had draped it lightly over her shoulders. She looked down at it. "You're still shaking," he said, without making it sound like an observation about weakness. He said it the way someone noted weather, a fact, without judgment. She started to say she was fine. She stopped, because she wasn't. "The pie is good here," Damien said instead. And he walked away from her table toward the diner exit with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his adult life needed to move fast, because nothing he was leaving behind was faster than he was. The bell above the door rang a second time. Evelyn sat for a long moment with his scarf across her shoulders and a business card in her hand and an untouched slice of apple pie in front of her, and she listened to the rain hitting the window, and she breathed. Her cell phone buzzed. A message from her attorney. "Travis's counsel just called. The Riverside motion is being withdrawn. What happened?" She set the phone face down on the table. She looked at the card again. No name, no title. Just 10 digits and the understanding that somewhere in this city, a man she had met 20 minutes ago had already made a phone call on her behalf, and someone on the other end of that call had moved immediately. She told herself it was unsettling. She told herself she should be suspicious, should be careful, should treat the disappearance of one threat as the possible arrival of another in different clothing. She had been married to Travis Holden. She knew exactly what gestures of protection looked like when they were actually instruments of control dressed up in better fabric. She picked up the card. She turned it over. The back was blank. She placed it in her portfolio, between the unsigned pages 3 and 7 and 11, between all the paperwork that represented the legal dismantling of the worst 7 years of her life. She ate 3 bites of the apple pie. It was, in fact, good. She left a tip large enough to cover the waitress's trouble and walked out into the rain. The message came 6 days later. She had spent those 6 days in her apartment on the Upper West Side, a two-bedroom she was paying for entirely on income that had been, as Travis had correctly noted, thinning. She had two active projects: a commercial renovation on the East Side for a hospitality group that was behind on payments, and a residential job in Brooklyn that the client had put on pause due to what she described as some personal things. She had 3 proposals outstanding, none of which had responded. She had outstanding invoices totaling more money than she wanted to think about. She was a talented designer. She knew that about herself without vanity. It was simply a fact she'd assembled from evidence over 15 years. From the commendations, from the repeat clients, from the particular way certain projects came together under her direction that wouldn't have come together the same way under someone else's. Her eye was specific. Her instincts were good. She knew how to make a space feel like the truest version of what it wanted to be. What she was less skilled at was the business of surviving a divorce from a man who had spent 7 years embedding himself into the infrastructure of her professional life without her noticing, knowing her clients, knowing her vendors, knowing exactly which relationships could be quietly poisoned with a word in the right ear at the right moment. She was only beginning to understand the full scope of the damage. The message came through her professional email, addressed formally, from a legal firm she recognized as legitimately reputable. Ms. Rhodes, our client has identified your portfolio through your published work and is interested in discussing a significant residential restoration project. The property is a historic Manhattan mansion currently in the early stages of renovation. Our client believes your specific expertise in adaptive restoration is uniquely suited to the scope. If you are available for a preliminary meeting, please respond to arrange a time at your convenience. She stared at the email for a long time. The firm was real. She looked them up, cross-referenced, checked the address. Real firm, real offices, established over 30 years. She searched the attorney's name attached to the signature. Real person, bar certified, no red flags. She searched for the property. A historic mansion on the Upper East Side, limestone facade, pre-war construction, recently changed hands after a lengthy estate proceeding. The sale price had been notable enough to appear in a real estate column she found with 2 minutes of searching. She searched the buyer's name, DeLuca Holdings, LLC. She sat back in her chair. She thought about the card in her portfolio. She thought about 6 days of quiet. No contact from Travis, no motion from his attorney, no calls from blocked numbers at 2 a.m. the way there had been during the worst months of the proceedings. 6 days of quiet that felt, after years of noise, almost like a trick. She thought about what her attorney would say, what her best friend Margot would say, what the careful, self-protective version of herself, the one that had taken 7 years of marriage to Travis to fully develop, would say. She picked up her phone and called the number on the card. He answered on the second ring. No greeting, just silence that was somehow identifiably his. "It's Evelyn Rhodes," she said. "I know. Your attorney sent me a project proposal." "Yes." She waited for him to explain, to elaborate, to fill the silence with justification the way most men did. He didn't. "I'm not interested in charity," she said. "It's not charity. The project is real. The budget is real. I need someone who understands historic restoration and has the judgment to make decisions I won't have to second guess." A pause. "That's not flattery. I looked at your published work." "And you happen to have looked at my published work." "I looked at your published work after I saw you reorganize everything on that table 4 times in 11 minutes, he said, "and decided I was curious about someone with that much nervous precision." She pressed her lips together. "That's not a normal thing to say to someone you're considering for a professional contract." "No." "Mr. DeLuca, Damien." Damien. The name felt strange in her mouth. Weighted. "Even if the project is genuine, which I'm not saying I believe, then taking work from you is not a simple thing." "No," he agreed. "It's not. You know what you are in this city." "Yes, and you know what it would look like." "To whom?" He asked it the way someone asked a math question, not rhetorically, but precisely, wanting the specific answer. She thought about it. Her remaining clients? Her professional contacts? The people who had already, at Travis's quiet suggestion, begun to drift? She thought about what her reputation currently looked like after 18 months of highly public divorce proceedings, with a man whose attorneys had not been subtle about painting her as unstable, difficult, financially reckless. The project pays $400,000, Damien said. Phased payments. First installment on signing regardless of timeline. The mansion has 14 rooms across 4 floors. The bones are original, 1912 construction. Some of the interior woodwork is irreplaceable if it's not handled correctly. A brief pause. I looked at what you did with the Harrington property in 2019, the library restoration specifically. I want that quality of attention. She had loved the Harrington Library. It had been the best work she'd ever done and the job that had almost broken her marriage. Travis had resented every hour she'd spent on it, had manufactured crises to pull her away from the site, had later claimed in front of their couple's therapist that her commitment to her work was a form of emotional abandonment. She had believed him for longer than she should have. I want to see the property first, she said. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. I'll send an address. I haven't agreed to anything. No, he said. Tomorrow at 10 you'll look at the property and decide whether you want to agree to anything. That's all. She should have said she'd think about it. She should have said she'd consult her attorney. She should have said any number of measured, careful things that the version of herself formed by 7 years with Travis Holden had learned to say as a form of protection. 10 o'clock, she said. She hung up before she could change her mind. The mansion was on 83rd Street, set back from the sidewalk behind a wrought iron fence that needed work but had good bones. The phrase arrived in her mind automatically, professionally, before she'd even pushed open the gate. The limestone facade was the color of old parchment, darkened in places by decades of city weather, and the arched windows on the second floor still had their original glass, slightly wavy. The kind of glass that made light do things modern glass couldn't. She stood on the sidewalk for 2 full minutes before she went inside. She had dressed carefully and then changed twice, and then decided she was being ridiculous and put on what she actually worked in: dark trousers, a charcoal turtleneck, her good boots, her leather portfolio. Professional but not performative. She was here to look at a building. The building didn't care what she was wearing. Damien was waiting inside the entrance hall. He was in different clothes than the diner, said, less formal, but the same quality. Dark wool trousers, a navy sweater that looked like it had been cut to his exact measurements, which it probably had. No jacket, no shoulder holster, though she found herself looking. He was standing in the entrance hall with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the original plasterwork on the ceiling, and he didn't turn when she came in, which she appreciated. It gave her 4 seconds to arrange her face into something professional. The entrance hall was extraordinary. Damaged, water-stained in the upper right corner, stripped in places where previous owners had made bad decisions about modernization, she could see where wall sconces had been ripped out and replaced with recessed lighting that was completely wrong for the space. But the bones were exactly what he'd described. A sweeping staircase with original iron balusters, a herringbone oak floor under years of grime, a ceiling height that no new construction could replicate. The water damage is from a roof repair that was done incorrectly in 2003, Damien said without preamble. The structural assessment is clean. The engineer's report is in the office on the second floor if you want it. The plaster restoration will be the most significant challenge. There's a craftsman in Queens who does period-accurate work. I'll introduce you if you take the project. She was already walking. This was what happened to her in spaces. The professional part of her brain simply engaged, overriding everything else, and she moved through rooms the way other people read text, absorbing, cataloging, beginning to hear what the space was asking for. She ran her hand along the staircase banister, original wood under coats of paint that had been applied without stripping. She could feel the carving beneath her fingers. This hasn't been stripped in 100 years, she said. No. The paint is covering something. I'd need to do exploratory work to see what the original finish was. That's why I need someone with judgment, he said. He was watching her, she realized, with the same quality of attention he'd had in the diner. Not intrusive, but complete. He didn't miss things. Someone who knows what questions to ask before they start taking things apart. She went through 4 rooms on the ground floor, speaking occasionally, noting the original fireplaces, the transom windows that needed glass matching, the pocket doors that had been painted shut at some point and would need to be freed and rehung. He followed. He didn't interfere. He answered questions when she asked them and stayed quiet when she didn't, which was rarer in clients than it should have been. In the back room, what would have been a morning room in the original floor plan, east-facing, with windows looking onto a walled garden, she stopped. The room had been emptied entirely. The floors had been partially refinished at some point, poorly, but the wall moldings were intact, and the light coming through the east windows at this hour was extraordinary. The kind of light that interior designers spent careers trying to engineer and that this room produced simply by existing. "This room," she said. "Yes," he said from the doorway. "What do you want it to be?" "I don't know yet." He paused. "That's a problem I'd leave to you." She turned and looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching the light move across the floor. "You said I'd be safe," she said. It came out before she had decided to say it. He didn't look surprised by the shift. "Yes." "What does that mean exactly? From a man like you?" He looked at her directly. "It means Travis Holden will not contact you, approach you, or have any agent contact or approach you for the duration of this project. It means if something changes, you'll know about it before it becomes a problem. It means there are people who will be aware of where you are." "That sounds like surveillance." "It sounds like protection." "Those are sometimes the same thing." He held her gaze. "They're not, in this case. You'll have full awareness of any security measures. Nothing will be done without your knowledge. If at any point you want it stopped, it stops." She thought about that. She thought about the 11 minutes in the diner and the reorganized fork and the feeling of Travis's hand on her wrist. 400,000, she said. Phased. First payment on signing. She looked around the morning room. She looked at the light. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." "Creative control is mine, completely. You can tell me your preferences and I'll consider them. You cannot override my professional decisions." "Agreed." "Payment terms in writing, enforceable by standard contract, not a handshake. My attorney will send documents today. And I want to meet whoever is running the security detail. Name, face, contact number. I'm not being watched by anonymous people." Something moved in his expression, the faintest indication of something she might have called approval, though she couldn't be certain. "His name is Marco," Damien said. "He'll be here at 2 o'clock if you want to meet him today." She breathed. She looked at the east-facing windows, at the extraordinary morning light, at the century-old bones of a room that had been waiting all this time for someone to understand what it needed. "I'll need 6 weeks to complete a full assessment before I can give you a restoration timeline," she said. "That's fine. And I want a studio set up on the second floor, drafting table, proper lighting, storage for materials. I work on site." "Done." She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, a brief beat, just long enough to be noticeable, and then he shook it. His grip was firm and precise and brief, the grip of someone who had shaken hands for 30 years and understood exactly what the gesture meant and what it didn't. "One more thing," he said, as she was turning to look at the garden through the windows. She waited. "Why you changed your mind? From the phone call yesterday. You were going to say you needed to think about it." She considered whether to answer that honestly. Then she considered the fact that he had sat in a diner booth for what must have been at least 20 minutes, quiet and patient, and had listened to a stranger being threatened and had chosen to do something about it without being asked. "The library at Harrington," she said. "You mentioned it specifically. Not the facade, not the public rooms. The library." She paused. "Travis never once in 7 years asked about a single project I worked on. Not once. He knew I was a designer the way he knew I had brown hair. A fact, not an interest." She held the portfolio tighter. "You looked at the work, the actual work." Damien said nothing. He simply nodded once, the small movement of someone receiving information they intended to keep. She turned back to the morning room windows. She had 6 weeks of assessment ahead of her, and a contract she hadn't signed yet, and a man standing in the doorway whose stillness she was already, against all better judgment, beginning to find steadying rather than alarming. She told herself she was here for the building. She told herself she would remember that. But in the east-facing light of a room that had been waiting 100 years for someone to understand it, Evelyn Rhodes felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately name, like a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not examine that feeling closely. She was not yet ready for what examining it would tell her. The contract arrived by 4 o'clock. She read every line of it twice, sitting at her kitchen table with a red pen, the way her late mother had taught her to read important documents, starting at the back and working forward so you couldn't be seduced by the reasonable opening paragraphs into skimming the parts that mattered. The terms were clean. The payment structure was exactly what he'd described. The creative control clause was phrased in language so unambiguous she suspected he'd written it himself rather than leaving it to an attorney trained to introduce helpful vagueness. She signed it. She sent it back. At 4:47 p.m., her phone buzzed. A wire transfer confirmation from her bank. First installment, exact amount specified, arrived without fanfare, without a message attached, without any indication that someone expected gratitude or acknowledgement. She sat with her phone in her hand and the confirmation on her screen. Then her phone buzzed again. A different number this time. A text message from an unknown contact. "This is Marco. Mr. DeLuca asked me to introduce myself. I'll be outside your building from tonight. You won't see me unless you need to. Call this number if anything feels wrong. Anything at all." She texted back, "What does your car look like?" 30 seconds. Black Tahoe. Plates ending 7741. She got up, went to her window, looked down at the street. Black Tahoe, parked across from her building. She watched it for 60 seconds. Nothing moved. She went back to her kitchen table. She thought about Travis's hand on her wrist. She thought about the word sparire in a language she barely understood, spoken quietly, over coffee, in a public place, by a man who had spent 7 years learning exactly how much pressure was required. She thought about the morning room on 83rd Street, and the east-facing light, and the bones of a building that had been waiting for someone with the right kind of attention. She opened her drafting software. She began. Outside, a black Tahoe sat quietly in the rain. And somewhere across the city, in an office she had never seen and wouldn't see for some time, a man she was only beginning to understand sat at a desk and looked at a photograph of the Harrington Library, the one she had restored in 2019, the one she had poured herself into while her marriage quietly fell apart around her. And the look on his face was not the look of a client reviewing a portfolio. It was something more careful than that, something he would not yet allow himself to name. Outside his window, the Manhattan rain continued to fall. Neither of them slept well that night. Evelyn because she was already designing the morning room in her head, already hearing what it needed, already understanding that this project was going to ask things of her she wasn't sure she had left to give. Damien because he was reading a 70-page intelligence brief on Travis Holden, every financial record, every associate, every pattern of behavior cataloged with the thoroughness of a man who had learned, through the specific education of a violent life, that the worst thing you could do was underestimate someone whose obsession had not yet run its full course. The brief ended with the single handwritten note in the margin, in Damien's own writing, from the first time he'd had Travis assessed, 3 days before the diner, before Evelyn had even known his name. It said, "He's not finished." He had been right then. He was still right now. And somewhere between the morning room light and the intelligence brief and the rain falling on a city too large to see all at once, the thing that was beginning between them, still unacknowledged, still carefully avoided, still dressed up in the clean language of contracts and professional arrangements, was already past the point where either of them could accurately say it had not yet started. It had started the moment he'd set down his espresso cup. They just hadn't admitted it to themselves yet. The rain fell. The city moved. And Travis Holden, in a townhouse on the Upper East Side, looked at his phone and at a photograph taken that morning outside a limestone mansion on 83rd Street. A photograph of Evelyn standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the facade, her portfolio under her arm, her face open in a way he had not seen in years. And the expression on his face was not finished. It was barely even begun. The first week on site taught Evelyn 3 things about Damien DeLuca. The first was that he kept his word with an exactness that felt almost mechanical. The studio on the second floor was ready when she arrived Monday morning, drafting table positioned under the north-facing skylight, the way she had specified in a single text sent the night before. The lighting installed by someone who had clearly been given precise instructions rather than general ones. She hadn't expected that. She had expected approximate. Men like Travis had always delivered approximate, and then expected gratitude for the effort. The second thing was that he was almost never there. She had prepared herself consciously and carefully for the specific discomfort of working inside a space that belonged to him. The ambient pressure of his presence. The sense of being observed that she had learned to associate with powerful men who did favors and then positioned themselves to collect. She had told Margot, who had reacted to the entire situation with the precise combination of alarm and barely contained fascination that characterized her responses to most things, that she was going in with her eyes open and her contract signed and her creative control clause in writing, and that she was not confused about what she was doing or who she was doing it for. What she had not prepared for was his absence. He came to the mansion 4 times in the first 2 weeks. Each visit was brief, 40 minutes, an hour at most. He asked specific questions, listened to her answers without interrupting, made decisions quickly when decisions were required, and left. He did not linger. He did not manufacture reasons to be in whatever room she was working in. He did not lean in doorways watching her the way she had caught herself half expecting him to. He treated the mansion as a project and treated her as the person running it, and that was, in its own specific way, more unsettling than surveillance would have been. The third thing she learned was that Marco was very good at his job. She had seen the Tahoe every morning for the first 3 days and then had stopped looking for it, not because it was gone, but because its presence had become absorbed into the background of her days the way traffic sounds became absorbed. Still there, just no longer requiring attention. Marco himself she had met twice. Once at the mansion, where he was a broad-shouldered, quiet man in his late 30s with the particular economy of movement, shared by people who had spent time in either the military or environments where unnecessary motion attracted the wrong kind of attention, and once outside her apartment building at 7 in the morning when she'd come down to find him standing on the sidewalk holding 2 coffees, one of which he handed to her without comment, and she had understood that this was not a social gesture, but a communication. "I am here. I see you. You are not alone." And she had taken the coffee and gone to work. What Marco didn't tell her, and what she found out on a Tuesday in the 3rd week through a phone call from her attorney, was that Travis had attempted to hire a private investigator 3 days after she had signed the DeLuca contract. The investigator had declined the work within 24 hours. No explanation offered. "Do you know why?" her attorney asked. "I can guess," Evelyn said. She called the number on the card. "Travis tried to hire someone," she said when Damien answered. "Yes." "You knew?" "Yes." She held the phone and looked at the half-stripped wall in front of her, the exploratory section she'd opened up to examine the original plaster composition, layers of history peeling back in careful sequence. "You could have told me." "He declined the work. There was nothing to tell you that required action." "There was something to tell me that was relevant to my life." A pause. When he spoke again, his voice was the same, unhurried, level, but there was something calibrated in it, something that suggested he was choosing words with more care than usual. "You're right. I should have told you." She had expected an argument. The absence of one was briefly disorienting. "Is there anything else I don't know?" she said. "He's made 3 calls in the past week to a number connected to a firm that does various kinds of work. We're watching the number. Nothing has been contracted yet." She pressed her free hand against the exposed plaster. It was cool. She focused on that. "What kind of work?" "The kind that ranges from intimidation to worse, depending on what a client is willing to spend." The plaster was very cool under her palm. "And you're watching it," she said. "Yes." "What does watching it mean exactly, in practical terms?" "It means if he makes a payment, we know within the hour. If he contracts something specific, we know before it's executed." A brief pause. "Evelyn, nothing is going to get close enough to require you to do anything except keep working." She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the word sparir again, which she had looked up properly after the diner. To disappear, to vanish, to cease to exist in the place where you were. She was thinking about the word arrangerò. "I will arrange it." "He said he'd arrange it," she said. "In the diner, in Italian. You heard it." "Yes." "Have you arranged things?" she asked. "For people, before." The silence on the line was 3 seconds long. It was the most informative 3 seconds of the conversation. "That's not what I'm doing here," he said. "That's not what I asked." "I know what you asked." His voice was unchanged. I'm not going to lie to you. My history is my history. What I'm doing now with this situation is different. Why? The second silence was shorter. Because I chose it to be. She took her hand off the plaster. She looked at the layers of stripped wall. 1912, 1930s, 1950s. Each decade's choices laid over the last one. Each generation of owners making decisions that seemed permanent at the time and turned out to be just another layer waiting to be carefully removed. Don't make decisions about what I need to know, she said. I've had 7 years of someone deciding what information was appropriate for me. I'm done with that. Understood, he said. No argument. No qualification. She hung up. She stood in the stripped room and breathed, and was angry for a moment. Not the explosive kind of anger she'd spent years suppressing around Travis, but the cleaner kind, the kind that arrived with information attached and told you something true about where you stood. Then she picked up her tools and kept working. Margot came to the mansion on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week, allegedly to bring lunch, but actually, as she made clear within the first 8 minutes, to conduct a comprehensive assessment. Margot Vance had been Evelyn's best friend for 14 years, which meant she had witnessed the entire arc of the Travis years from a position of helpless, frequently furious proximity, had watched Evelyn diminish by increments so small they were individually invisible and collectively catastrophic, had offered the apartment on her couch 3 times during the worst periods, had sat with Evelyn through 2 separate emergency room visits attributed on the official paperwork to accidents that Margot had never believed for a single moment were accidents. She was small, blunt, a copywriter by profession, and a catastrophist by temperament, and she walked through the mansion's entrance hall with her head rotating in a slow arc of combined architectural admiration and personal suspicion. Okay, she said, standing in the entrance hall. The building is incredible. I'm not getting distracted by the building. The building is the point, Evelyn said. The building is a setup. Margot turned to look at her. You know that, right? He saw a beautiful, talented woman being threatened in a diner, and he said, I know what will help. A massive professional project inside my home. That's a move, Ev. That's a very old move with a very expensive backdrop. He's rarely here. That's also a move. The absent, powerful man is a type. You haven't met him. I don't need to meet him to know the category. Evelyn handed her a container of soup from the bag and sat down on the dust sheet-covered window seat in the front parlor, which she'd been using as a lunch spot for 3 weeks. He keeps his word. He's not here watching me. He told me when he withheld information, and I told him not to do it again, and he said understood, and it hasn't happened since. Margot looked at her carefully over her soup container. When did you tell him not to withhold information? 3 weeks ago. And you've talked to him since then? About the project? Yes. Just the project. Evelyn ate her soup. Evelyn. He's a client, Margot. He's a client who had someone parked outside your apartment within 12 hours of you signing a contract. He's a client who apparently already knew who Travis was before the diner encounter, which, has that occurred to you? That he knew? That this might not be the coincidence it looked like? It had occurred to her. She had turned it over many times in the weeks since, looking at it from different angles, and she had not been able to make it resolve into something clean. She had asked Marco once, obliquely, whether Damien frequented that diner. Marco had said, with the specific careful neutrality of someone whose job required it, that Mr. DeLuca moved through the city on a varied schedule, which was not a no. I've thought about it, she said. And I don't know. She paused. But even if it wasn't coincidence, even if he already knew something about Travis, he still said something in that diner when he could have stayed in his booth and drunk his coffee. He still made a call that killed a legal motion the same afternoon. Because it served him to do it. Maybe. She set down her soup. Or maybe sometimes people do things because someone needed them to be done and they were there. Margot looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a person who loves someone enough to be frightened for them. Just don't lose the thread, she said finally, of who you are in this. You just got out of 7 years of organizing your whole self around someone else. Don't walk straight into another version of that. I know. Do you? Evelyn looked at the entrance hall, at the staircase she was going to restore to its original finish. At the floor she'd had professionally cleaned last week that had turned out to be extraordinary under 30 years of grime, at the building that kept revealing itself to her in layers, patient and full of good bones. "I know," she said again, and meant it, and also knew that knowing a thing and being impervious to a thing were not the same. Damien arrived at the mansion at 6 o'clock that evening. She was still there. She often worked late, the building quieter in the evenings, the light changing in ways she needed to track for the lighting plan. She heard the front door open and the specific sound of his footsteps, which she had, without meaning to, learned to distinguish from Marco's and from the footsteps of the workmen who came in the mornings. She was in the library, the room on the second floor that she had identified in her first week as the most complex restoration challenge on the property, its shelving original and intact but damaged, its ceiling plasterwork requiring the period craftsman Damien had mentioned, its windows looking west in a way that produced extraordinary evening light. He came to the doorway and stopped. He looked at the room the way she had looked at it when she'd first found it, with the particular attention of someone who recognized what they were seeing. "How long have you been in here?" he asked. "Since 4. He looked at the notes on her drafting table, the material samples pinned to the wall, the detailed elevation drawings she'd been working on for the shelving restoration. He didn't touch any of it. "Can I show you something?" she said. He came into the room. She led him to the west-facing window, positioned him so the light was coming from the right angle, and then she reached up and pressed lightly on the crown molding above the window frame, a specific spot she'd found by accident 3 days ago, running her hands along every surface the way she did in buildings that still had things to tell her. A section of the molding swung inward. Behind it was a narrow recess, perhaps 8 inches deep, running the length of the window. Inside the recess were 2 objects, a slim leather-bound volume and a folded architectural drawing on paper so old it had gone the color of weak tea. She had not touched either of them. Damien looked at them for a moment. "Have you opened them?" he said. "No, they're yours." He reached in carefully and withdrew the architectural drawing first. He unfolded it with the same economy and precision he brought to everything. 4 folds, carefully handled, laid on the drafting table. It was the original floor plan of the mansion, 1912. Signed in a corner, she had to lean close to read, W. Harmon, architect. "My God," she said, without planning to. He picked up the leather volume. He opened it to the first page and read what was written there silently. His face didn't change in any dramatic way, but something moved through it, something she couldn't categorize. He turned the volume so she could see the first page. It was a journal. The handwriting was small and deliberate. The name on the first page was a woman's name, and the date on the first entry was October 1912. 114 years, Evelyn said, waiting in the wall. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody looked. He said it the way he said most things, without emphasis, without implication. But she felt the implication anyway. She became aware of how quiet the room was. The workmen had been gone for 3 hours. Marco was downstairs or outside, present but not present. The evening light was coming through the west windows in long amber bars, and she was standing close enough to Damien that she could see the thin scar that ran along his left jawline, barely visible, the kind of scar that came from something specific and had been carried long enough to fade but not disappear. She took a step back. "I want to get a conservator in to look at the journal," she said, returning to professional ground with the deliberateness of someone who had felt the footing shift and was choosing solid surface. "The paper is fragile, and the architectural drawing should be properly stored. It's the most significant historical document in the building." "Agreed." He looked at her. "Evelyn." She met his eyes. "Margot Vance," he said. "Your friend who came today. She's worried about you." Evelyn was very still. "Did you have someone watching the building?" Marco mentioned it. He recognizes her from before. "From before what?" "From before you. I know who your people are. That's part of keeping you safe." She felt the anger come back, cleaner and colder this time. "That's the second time you've had information about my life that you didn't tell me you had. I'm telling you now. Because I found out." He held her gaze. He didn't flinch from it, and he didn't try to smooth it over. "You're right," he said. "That's a line I'm figuring out as I go. Figure it out faster." "Yes." She picked up her portfolio from the drafting table. She was leaving, not in anger, but in the deliberate way of someone who has a boundary and is demonstrating it rather than just stating it. The shelving restoration starts Monday, she said. The craftsman you mentioned, I need his contact by tomorrow. You'll have it tonight. She nodded. She walked to the door. She's not wrong, Damien said behind her. She stopped. She didn't turn around. Your friend, he said. She's not wrong to be worried. About what specifically? A beat. About the fact that I had reasons for being in that diner before I had a reason to speak up in it. She turned around. He was standing in the library's evening light, with the 1912 journal in his hands, and the expression of a man who had just decided that honesty was less dangerous than the alternative. Tell me, she said. I knew who Travis Holden was before the diner. I'd seen a preliminary report. Someone in his financial network was connected to a business matter I was watching. His name came up. I knew he was going through a divorce, and I knew the name of the person he was divorcing. He paused. I didn't go to that diner because of you. I was there for a separate reason, on a separate matter. But you knew who I was when you sat down. I knew your name. I didn't know you. She absorbed this. She weighed it against the untouched apple pie and the card with no name on it and the wire transfer that had arrived without ceremony and the way he stood in doorways without filling them with his own ego. And the project? The project is real. The Harrington Library is real. None of that was manufactured. He set the journal down carefully on the drafting table. But I want you to have all the information. You told me not to make decisions about what you need to know. Yes, she said. I did. She stood in the doorway of the library in the amber evening light, and she thought about layers, plaster and paint, and decisions made one on top of another, and what you found when you stripped it back carefully enough. Thank you, she said, for telling me. She left. On the stairs going down, she passed Marco coming up, who said nothing and simply moved aside with the particular tact of a man professionally trained to be present without intruding. She went out through the front door into the cooling September evening and stood on the sidewalk in front of the wrought iron fence and breathed. She stood there for 4 minutes. Then she went home and worked until midnight and did not let herself think about the scar on his jawline or the way he'd said, I didn't know you, with the specific precision of someone who understood the difference between a name and a person. She did not let herself think about it. She almost succeeded. 3 days later, her car's brake line was cut. She didn't know it at the time. She found out because she never made it to the car. Marco was at her side before she reached the street, his hand on her arm, steering her back toward the building entrance with the calm urgency of a man who was managing a situation that had just accelerated past the parameters he'd been assigned. Don't ask questions yet, he said quietly. Just come inside. What? Inside, Ms. Rhodes, please. She went inside. He was on his phone within seconds, speaking in a low, rapid Italian she couldn't follow. She stood in the building lobby and looked at her hands and felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with the October air coming through the door. When Marco hung up, he looked at her with the careful steadiness of someone delivering information that needed to land without causing panic. We found a modification to your vehicle this morning during a routine sweep. The brake line. It would have failed at speed, likely on the highway or on a significant downhill grade. He paused. You were not in danger this morning because we were doing our job, but it happened last night, which means someone had access to your parking structure, which means we need to change your location and your route patterns starting today. She heard every word. She processed every word. She thought about Travis in the diner, speaking Italian, saying "Arangaro." Her phone was already ringing. She looked at the screen. Damien. She answered it. Are you inside? He said. Yes? Stay there. Marco will move you within the hour. A pause. And in that pause, she heard something she hadn't heard in his voice before. Something tightly controlled that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was adjacent to both. I should have moved faster on the contractor number. We were watching the call, we were watching the payment, but the timeline was faster than projected. He paid someone. Yes. They've been identified. They won't be a problem after today. His voice was very level. She understood that level in a different way now than she had 3 weeks ago. What does that mean? She said. It means they won't be near you again. Damien. She pressed her hand flat against the lobby wall. I need you to tell me what's happening. All of it. Not on the phone. When Marco gets you somewhere secure, I'll come to you. A brief pause. Are you all right? She thought about what all right meant in this context. She thought about the specific arithmetic of the morning, the routine sweep that had found the modification, the assumption that without that sweep she would have gotten in her car, she would have driven, she would have reached speed on the highway heading to 83rd Street, and the brakes would have... I'm all right, she said. She wasn't shaking. She noticed that. She was colder than she'd been, and she was breathing carefully, measured, controlled, but she wasn't shaking. Something had changed in her in the weeks since the diner. Or possibly something had been there all along, waiting for a situation that required it. I'll be there in 40 minutes, Damien said. He arrived in 32. She was in a safe house apartment she hadn't known existed. 2 blocks from the mansion, owned through 3 layers of corporate structure she would never be able to trace on her own, furnished with the specific functional anonymity of spaces designed for exactly this kind of urgent relocation. Marco had brought her here and made her tea she didn't drink and positioned himself outside the door, and that was where things stood when Damien came through it. He looked at her first. Before he spoke to Marco, before he took off his coat, before he did anything, he looked at her with the specific completeness of a man checking something that mattered to him for damage. She looked back at him and understood in that moment that they had moved past the point where this was a professional arrangement and both of them were still pretending it was. She understood it, and she did not look away. Travis is escalating, he said, finally taking off his coat. He sat across from her. He put everything on the table, the contractor Travis had hired, the payment amount, the specific modification to her brakes, the timeline, the response his people had already executed. He spoke in the same precise, unhurried way he always spoke, but his jaw was tight in a way that was new. When he finished, she said, "What do we do now? You stay here for 48 hours. We reassess your security profile, and I need to make a decision about Travis." "What kind of decision?" He met her eyes. "The kind that I've been holding off on making because I wasn't certain it was necessary." She understood what he was saying. She understood it in the way you understood things you didn't have clean words for, the way you understood weather before it broke. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't make that decision. Not yet. There has to be another way." She held his gaze. "If you do that, if you take it that far, there's no version of whatever this is that survives it." The room was quiet. Outside, the city moved in its relentless, ordinary way, indifferent and enormous. Whatever this is. She had said it. She had named it as a thing that existed, as a thing that could survive or not survive depending on the choices made in this room tonight. Damien looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years making decisions in rooms like this one, alone, without anyone waiting on the outcome for personal reasons. "There's another way," he said finally. "It requires patience." "I have patience," she said. "I restored a library that had been buried under 40 years of bad decisions. I know how to wait for the right moment to take something apart." Something moved through his face, that thing she had cataloged and kept returning to and refused to name. "He's going to come harder," Damien said. "Now that this didn't work, he'll come harder. What happens next will be worse than a brake line." "I know. You're not going to ask me to step back, to hand this to the authorities and walk away. The authorities don't scare Travis, you do," she said it plainly. "I'm not naive about what that means." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a phone on the table between them. A secondary phone, clean, with a single number already programmed. "That goes directly to me," he said. "Not through Marco, not through the office. Directly." She looked at the phone. She looked at him. She picked it up. Outside in the parking structure 2 blocks away, her car sat with a severed brake line and evidence that would take investigators 3 weeks to fully process. Travis Holden, in his townhouse across town, was already on his phone to a second contact. Not the contractor this time. Someone with a wider operational capability. Someone who charged accordingly and asked fewer questions. And somewhere between the safe house and the mansion and the severed brake line, a line had been crossed from which there was no measured, professional, carefully contracted retreat. The only direction left was forward, and forward, for the first time in a very long time, was somewhere Evelyn Rhodes was no longer afraid to go. The 48 hours in the safe house passed, the way certain kinds of waiting always passed. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific texture of time that has weight to it, that presses down on the shoulders and behind the eyes, and makes the ordinary sounds of a city outside a window feel very far away. Evelyn worked. She had her laptop, her drafting software, the photographs she'd taken of every room in the mansion over the past weeks. She spread her notes across the safe house table, and she worked on the library elevation drawings, and she did not allow herself to sit in the silence and think about brake lines and what happened to cars on highways when brakes failed at speed. She had learned this particular skill during the marriage, the ability to route herself around the things she couldn't afford to look at directly, to keep her hands moving, to let the work be the container for everything the rest of her couldn't hold. Damien came twice during the 48 hours. Both visits were brief, updates on the contractor situation, confirmation that her parking structure had been swept and secured, a discussion about whether she returned to the mansion immediately or waited another week. She said immediately. He said Tuesday. She said Monday. He said Tuesday. And the way he said it left no room for negotiation, and she recognized that she was not annoyed by this the way she would have been annoyed if Travis had said it, because the difference between control and protection was a thing she had spent 7 years getting wrong and was only now beginning to calibrate correctly. Monday night, alone in the safe house, she called Margot. She didn't tell her about the brake line. She told her she was staying somewhere different for a few days, a precaution, nothing dramatic. Margot was silent for a moment and then said, in the specific tone she used when she was choosing not to say the larger thing she was thinking, "Are you okay?" "Yes." "Are you actually okay, or are you performing okay?" "I'm working on the difference," Evelyn said. Margot was quiet for another moment. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "Travis?" "No." "What's going to stop him?" Evelyn looked at the safe house wall. "Something that isn't me." She heard Margot breathe. "Okay," Margot said. "Okay. Call me when you're back at the apartment." "I will." She didn't sleep well. She hadn't slept well since the diner, really. Not badly, not the way she'd slept during the worst years with Travis, when sleep was a place he could follow her into. Just lightly, close to the surface. The kind of sleep that left you functional but never quite rested, never quite all the way down. Tuesday morning, Marco drove her back to the mansion. She walked through the front door and stood in the entrance hall and let the building receive her the way it always did, with the particular quiet dignity of something very old that had seen many people come and go and had survived all of them. She put her hand on the staircase banister. She breathed. She went upstairs, and she worked. Cannes, the charity gala, had been Damien's idea. Or more accurately, it had been on the calendar for months, arranged by the foundation he supported, a showcase of the mansion's partial restoration to raise funds for architectural preservation. Evelyn had known about it and had factored it into her timeline, had made sure the public rooms on the ground floor and the library on the second were at a presentable stage by the date. She had not, until the week before, understood that she was expected to attend. "You're the designer," Damien said. It was a Thursday afternoon, both of them in the library, where the shelving restoration was nearly complete, the original wood revealed and treated, the period hardware sourced and installed, the room beginning to look like what it had always been trying to be. The work deserves a name attached to it. "I'm not a gala person." "Neither am I." He said it with the faint and specific dryness that she had come to recognize as the closest he came to humor. "You're hosting it." "Which is different from enjoying it." She looked at the restored shelving. She looked at the room that had been waiting since 1912 for someone to give it back to itself. She thought about what Margot had said about losing the thread of who she was. 2 hours, she said. "I do 2 hours, and then I leave." 2 hours is enough. She bought a dress she could work in if she had to. Dark navy, clean lines, nothing that required architectural undergarments, or shoes that prevented movement. She told herself this was practical. She told herself she was not thinking about the way Damien had looked at the library when the shelving was finally complete, the way something had settled in his face that she had come to recognize as the closest he came to satisfaction. She told herself a great many things that week. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, the October air sharp enough to make the mansion's lit facade look dramatic rather than merely beautiful. Evelyn arrived 40 minutes before guests, walked the public rooms one final time with her professional eye, adjusted two lamp positions in a floral arrangement that was wrong for the period, and then stood in the restored library and let herself feel, briefly and privately, the specific satisfaction of work done exactly as well as it could be done. She felt it for perhaps 90 seconds. Then she heard voices in the entrance hall, and the evening began. There were perhaps 120 guests. Architects, preservationists, the particular tier of New York money that attached itself to cultural events the way it attached itself to everything, with the dual motives of genuine interest and public visibility. Evelyn moved through the rooms answering questions about the restoration, explaining decisions, accepting compliments with the grounded directness that was her professional manner and had always been, Travis's sustained campaign to erode it notwithstanding. She saw Damien across the entrance hall at 7:15. He was in a dark suit, no surprise, and he was speaking to two men she didn't recognize, and he had the contained quality he always had in public, the quality of a man whose natural state was internal and who could perform the external requirements of social situations with complete competence and zero investment. He caught her eye across the room. He nodded once. She nodded back. She told herself this was a professional acknowledgement between a client and his contractor, and went to answer a question from a preservationist about the original plasterwork. At 8 o'clock, Damien found her in the morning room, the east-facing room she had loved from the first day, now complete, the light fixtures period appropriate, the walls restored to a color she had found documented in a 1914 interior photograph sourced from a city archive. "The room," he said. "Yes, you got it exactly right." "I know." She said it without false modesty, because false modesty about work she had done well was a habit Travis had encouraged, and she was done with it. Something crossed his face, that thing again, the thing she kept not naming. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said. "An architect who's been doing preservation work for 30 years. He knew Harrington, the client from 2019. He asked about your work specifically." "I'd like that." He walked with her through the crowded entrance hall toward the far parlor, and she was aware, not uncomfortably, of the way the room shifted when he moved through it, the way certain people registered his presence and adjusted their posture slightly, the way the space around him stayed clear without anyone obviously creating it. They were halfway across the hall when Marco appeared at Damien's left shoulder. He appeared the way Marco always appeared, without drama, without urgency on his face, but with the specific quality of presence that communicated, to anyone trained to read it, that something had changed. Damien stopped. Marco leaned in and said something very quietly close to his ear. 3 sentences at most. Evelyn watched Damien's face. Nothing moved in it. Nothing visible. But she had spent enough weeks studying this particular face to see the thing that happened beneath the surface. The instant, complete stillness of a man who has received information that requires him to recalculate everything. He turned to her. "I need you to go upstairs," he said. "The library. Stay there. Marco will—" She heard it before she understood it. Glass. The sound of the front windows breaking was not the explosive dramatic crash of films. It was a series of smaller sounds, sequential, methodical, each one followed immediately by the specific percussion of something entering the room. And then the screaming started, and Evelyn understood what was happening in the same moment that Damien's hand closed around her arm, and he was moving, pulling her with him toward the staircase. Not running, but moving with the absolute directed efficiency of a man whose body knew this situation and had responses already loaded. "Up," he said. She went up. Behind them, the entrance hall descended into the noise of 120 people encountering sudden and incomprehensible danger, the sounds of chairs overturning, of heels on marble, of voices climbing the register from confusion to fear. She heard Marco below, his voice cutting through the noise with the calm authority of someone who had trained for exactly this, directing guests toward the rear exits. Damien got her to the library and closed the door. He reached under his suit jacket. The shoulder holster was not empty tonight. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Stay behind the shelving," he said, "away from the door. If someone comes through that door who isn't me or Marco, you go out the window onto the 3rd-floor ledge and you move to the east corner. There's a fire escape. Marco showed you." Marco had shown her. 2 weeks ago, casual, framed as a general safety orientation for the building. She had not understood at the time what it was actually for. "How many?" she said. Unclear. At least 4, possibly 6. He was at the door listening. Travis hired well this time. She pressed her back against the restored shelving. The wood was solid behind her. She focused on that. Damien. He looked at her. Come back, she said. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a plain statement of requirement, the way you stated the load-bearing facts of a structure. This needs to hold. This matters. This is not optional. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he went out the door. Though she heard it all, she couldn't see any of it, pressed against the shelving in the dark library with the sounds of the building translating the situation to her in real time. Footsteps on the stairs, voices in Italian she couldn't follow, a single sharp sound from the second-floor landing that she identified and then refused to identify, and then a longer silence, and then Marco's voice from outside the door saying her name. She crossed the room and opened the door. Marco had a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding with the steady dedication of head wounds. He looked at her assessment of the cut and said, "It's nothing," in the tone of a man who had had worse and expected to again. "Where is he?" "Grand ballroom, ground floor. It's contained." He paused. "Travis is in the building." She felt the cold again. The specific cold from the safe house, from the brake line, from the diner. "What do you mean he's in the building?" "He came in with the team. He's here personally." Marco looked at her with the careful steadiness she'd come to read as his version of alarm. "Mr. DeLuca has him. It's contained, but I need you to stay. Take me down." "Miss Rhodes." "Marco." She looked at him directly. "Take me down or I go myself." He took her down. The grand ballroom was at the rear of the ground floor, the largest room in the mansion, the one Evelyn had not yet begun restoring, its floors still rough and its walls stripped to bare plaster. The guests were gone. The caterers were gone. The room held 4 people. 2 of Damien's men she recognized from the security detail, Travis Holden and Damien. Travis was against the far wall. He was not restrained. There was nothing physical holding him, but he was against the wall the way a man was against a wall when what was in front of him was worse than what was behind him. He had lost the coat somewhere. His collar was open. His hair, always precise, was wrong. He looked, for the first time in the 11 years she had known him, like exactly what he was. Not the polished, controlled, reasonable in public version, but the architecture underneath it, which was smaller and meaner and more frightened than the facade had ever suggested. He saw her come through the door. Something moved across his face that she had not seen before and hoped to never see again. A flash of the specific cornered fury of a man whose carefully constructed image of himself has just been destroyed in front of the person he most needed to believe in it. Damien stood perhaps 8 feet from Travis. He had his jacket off. The holster was visible. His hands were at his sides and he was completely still. He did not look at Evelyn when she entered the room. His eyes stayed on Travis. "She doesn't need to be here," Travis said. His voice was doing the thing it did when he was trying to reassemble control, going very precise, very modulated, borrowing the costume of reasonableness. "No," Damien said. "She doesn't. She chose to be." Travis looked at her. The fury cycled down into something more familiar. The expression she had spent 7 years navigating, the one that was not anger on the surface, but was all anger underneath. "Evelyn, this is not what you think it is." "What is it?" she said. "This man is dangerous. Whatever he's told you, whatever version of himself he's presented, Travis." She heard her own voice, flat, steady. "You paid someone to cut my brake line." He said nothing. "Say it," she said. "You've been speaking in rooms for years knowing I couldn't understand you. Say it directly to my face." The silence stretched, and then Damien said very quietly, "Tell her the rest." Travis's eyes moved to him. "Tell her what you told the contractor," Damien said. "We have the recording. Tell her yourself or I play it in this room." Something happened to Travis's face. The remaining architecture of the controlled, reasonable man she had married fell away entirely. And what was underneath was not what she had expected. Not rage, not cruelty in its active form, but something more disorganized than that. Something that looked stripped of everything else, like panic. "There was never going to be a kidnapping," Travis said. His voice came out wrong, too fast, the careful modulation gone. "It was leverage. It was always leverage. I needed her back at the table. I needed her to understand that the settlement terms were unacceptable and that she didn't have the position she thought she... The break line, Damien said. That was meant to scare her, not... The contractor's instructions were not to scare her. Travis stopped. The room was very quiet. Evelyn listened to the silence and understood, with the specific and terrible clarity that arrived sometimes without warning, that she had been living next to something for 7 years that she had consistently underestimated. Not underestimated because she was naive. She knew she wasn't naive. She had seen things clearly enough in the early years to make the choices she'd made. Underestimated because the version of Travis she had been fighting in the divorce proceedings, the controlling, financially manipulative, publicly reasonable version, that version had been the contained one. The one with enough self-interest to maintain limits. The limits, she now understood, had been eroding for a year and a half. And what was left, cornered in this stripped ballroom with the caterers gone and the guests gone, and the elegant facade of the gala dismantled into bare plaster and emergency lighting, was something that had never actually intended to let her leave. She felt this understanding arrive in her body before it finished arriving in her mind. Felt it as a physical thing, a reorganization of weight, as if the room had tilted 2 degrees. You were never going to sign the papers, she said. Travis looked at her. Not because of the property, she said. That was the reason you gave yourself. But that wasn't it. His jaw tightened. His jaw. You were never going to let me be done, she said. With or without the settlement. With or without the property. You were never going to let it be finished. You don't understand what you're... I understand completely. Her voice was her own, not performed calm, not the careful steadiness she'd been practicing since the diner. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting underneath all the careful practice to be used. You told me for 7 years that without you I was nothing, and I believed it long enough to become small enough to almost make it true. And then I stopped. She looked at him across the room. And you couldn't tolerate that. Travis's face did something she had never seen it do. The panic reorganized itself into something that was almost grief. Almost but not quite, because grief required caring about the other person's reality, and what Travis felt was the grief of a man whose object had ceased to function correctly. It was grief directed entirely inward. Play the recording, she said to Damien. Damien looked at her. Whatever he said to the contractor, she said. I need to hear it. Evelyn, I need to hear it. He held her gaze for one moment. Then he reached into his pocket and produced his phone and pressed play. Travis's voice filled the ballroom. Clean audio, close capture. The recording had been made from very near, from inside the conversation itself. She listened to her ex-husband's voice, precise and calm and businesslike, describe what he wanted done to her car, and when that should happen, and what should happen after. And she stood in the stripped ballroom and she breathed through it the way she had breathed through other things that had tried to undo her, carefully, from the diaphragm, counting the seconds of each exhale. When it ended, the room was completely silent. Travis was looking at the floor. I have a question, Evelyn said. She looked at Damien. You said there was a second contact after the brake line failed, someone with wider operational capability. Damien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. They've been identified, he said. Are they here tonight? Was tonight the operation? The silence lasted a second too long. Some of them, he said. She processed this. You knew he was coming tonight. We suspected. We had indicators. We didn't have confirmation until 20 minutes before the first window broke. 20 minutes. She looked at him. You let the gala proceed. We had the perimeter. We had the team. The risk was, you let 120 people walk into a building you knew might be attacked. The risk assessment. Did you know or didn't you? His jaw was tight. We had strong indicators, not confirmation. She looked at him for a long moment. The restored library above them, the morning room, the entrance hall with its stripped staircase given back to itself, the weeks of work, the east-facing light, the hidden journal, the architectural drawing signed in 1912. She thought about the line between protection and control. She had said they were different. She had believed it. She still believed it. But she was standing in a ballroom in a dress she'd bought to be useful in emergencies, and 120 people had just fled through the rear exits of a building she had spent weeks restoring, and the man who had tried to have her killed was against the wall behind her. and the man she had begun, against all judgment, against all the careful protective architecture she'd built around herself, to trust, had known this might happen and had let it proceed. "The guests," she said. "Were they hurt?" "No." Marco from near the door. "Everyone is out. There are minor injuries from the exit. Nothing serious?" She breathed. She looked at Damien. "We're going to talk about this," she said. "All of it. Every decision you made tonight and why." "Yes," he said. "After." She looked at Travis. "What happens to him now?" Damien looked at Travis with an expression that was not anger. It was beyond anger, on the other side of it, in the territory of absolute cold assessment. "His confession is recorded," Damien said. "The federal investigators who've been building a case on his financial network for 14 months received an anonymous package 3 days ago that accelerated their timeline considerably." He paused. "They were already outside the building when this started. They've been waiting for an occasion to move." Travis looked up. The sound that came from him was not a word. It was the sound of a specific kind of understanding arriving all at once. "You built it," Travis said. "The whole thing, the gala, the night." "You built it," Damien said. "I gave you enough room to finish what you'd already started. You made every choice yourself." The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. 3 people entered in the specific purposeful way of people who have been waiting outside a door for their moment and have now arrived at it. They wore the particular clothing of federal authority, and they moved with the calm of people who had warrants in their pockets and evidence on drives and a timeline that was finally exactly where it needed to be. Evelyn watched them cross the ballroom. She watched the handcuffs come out. She watched Travis Holden, who had spent 7 years telling her she was nothing without him, who had put his hand on her wrist in a diner and spoken in a language he believed she couldn't understand about making her disappear. She watched him look at her one final time as the cuffs clicked into place. She met his eyes. She felt nothing she would have predicted, not triumph, not relief, not yet. Relief was for later, for quieter rooms. What she felt, standing in the stripped ballroom in the dress she'd bought to be useful, was something she didn't have a clean word for. The feeling of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was separate from her body finally being set down. The feeling of her own hands, empty and unencumbered, belonging only to her. They took him out. The room was quiet. She stood in the quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to look at Damien. He was watching her with the expression she'd spent weeks cataloging and refusing to name. His jacket was off. The holster was there. The scar on his jaw caught the emergency lighting in the specific way of old things that had healed imperfectly and didn't apologize for it. "The gala," she said. "Evelyn, I'm not done being angry about it. I know. I need you to understand that." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand that I'm not someone whose safety gets factored into a risk assessment without my knowledge. I'm not a variable. I'm the person you said you were protecting." "Yes," he said. His voice was tight in a way she had not heard before. "You're right. What I did tonight was, I made the calculation I've always made. Where the acceptable risk is, what the parameters are, who gets to decide. I made it without you." He paused. "That was wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning room, the east-facing light, the 1912 journal in the wall. "I know why you did it," she said finally. "I know the calculation. I know why you've been making that calculation your whole life, alone, without accounting for anyone else in the equation. Because for your whole life, that's been the only safe way to make it." He was very still. "I'm telling you," she said, "that it can't work that way anymore. Not with me in it. If I'm in it, I'm in it." The ballroom held them both in its stripped, unrestored silence. Plaster walls, rough floors, the bones of a room that hadn't been finished yet. "Are you?" he said. "In it." She looked at him. She thought about every careful thing she had told herself since the diner, every professional boundary, every maintained distance, every time she had redirected her own attention back to the work and away from the particular quality of his stillness in doorways. She thought about a woman standing on a sidewalk in front of an iron fence, looking up at a building that was full of good bones and waiting to be understood. "Yes," she said. The word landed in the room, and from somewhere outside the mansion, from the street where federal vehicles were now present, and neighbors had gathered and the ordinary machinery of consequence was finally, irreversibly in motion, came the sound of the city. Enormous and indifferent and continuing, the way it always continued, regardless of what happened inside any particular building on any particular night, regardless of what was, finally and without any possibility of retreat, beginning. They didn't sleep that night. Not because there wasn't time. The federal agents were done with the mansion by 2 in the morning, the scene processed, the statements taken, the last vehicle pulling away from the curb outside while a cold October wind moved through the broken ground floor windows and made the restored entrance hall feel exposed in a way it hadn't since before Evelyn had started working on it. There was time to sleep. There was simply no version of either of them that was capable of it. Evelyn sat in the library with her knees pulled up on the window seat and a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, looking at the restored shelving and not really seeing it. Damien sat at the drafting table with his jacket still off and the shoulder holster still on and a phone in his hand that he checked every 11 minutes with the regularity of a man whose nervous system ran on information the way other people's ran on oxygen. Marco had gone, sent home by Damien at midnight with the specific authority of someone who could tell when the people around him had run out of useful things to do. At 2:40 in the morning, Evelyn said, "Who is he?" Damien looked up from the phone. "The second contractor," she said. "The one with wider operational capability. Travis hired him after the break line. You said some of them were here tonight." She looked at him across the room. "Some, not all." He set the phone face down on the drafting table. "His name is Carver," Damien said. "He operates out of 3 cities. He takes specific kinds of contracts, the kind that don't get reported, don't get investigated, don't leave a recoverable trail." A pause. "He's careful. More careful than the first contractor. And he was paid before tonight, which means the contract is still active." The cold tea in her hands felt colder. "Travis is in federal custody," she said. "The contract doesn't die with the client's freedom. It dies when it's completed or when Carver decides it's not worth the exposure." He held her gaze. "He'll make that decision in the next 24 to 48 hours. Either he assesses that the federal attention makes completion too risky, or he decides to finish the job on principle because leaving active contracts open damages his professional reputation. And you don't know which way he goes." "Not yet." She put the cold tea down on the window seat beside her. She looked at her hands, the drawing hand, the right one, with the faint marks still visible on the inside of the wrist from the diner, long faded now, but still readable if you knew what you were looking at. "What do we do?" she said. "You stay in the building tonight. Tomorrow we move you to—" "No." She said it flatly, without heat. "I'm not doing the safe house again. I'm not going somewhere small and waiting for a man I've never met to decide whether killing me is worth his professional reputation. Evelyn, tell me what you're doing about Carver." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to read as his version of internal conflict, not visible in any dramatic way, just a slight shift in the quality of his stillness, as if something underneath was applying pressure. "I have people looking for him," Damien said. "Finding him takes time. He's careful about location." "How much time?" 24 hours. Maybe less. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you stay where I can control the perimeter." She held his gaze. "You said I was in it." "I said yes. That means I need to know what you know when you know it. Not managed, not the version you've decided I can handle." He was quiet for a long moment. "There are 2 possible locations he uses in the city," Damien said. "We're running both down tonight. If we find him before he moves, this ends in the next few hours. If we don't—" He stopped. "If you don't, then it becomes a different kind of problem." She nodded. She understood the shape of the thing, even if she didn't know all its dimensions. She had spent weeks in this building understanding how to read structures, where the weight was, where the stress points were, where the thing was most likely to fail. This situation had the same architecture. She could feel where it was load-bearing. "Get some sleep," she said. He looked at her. "You check your phone every 11 minutes, she said. "That's not strategy, that's anxiety. You can't think straight on no sleep and anxiety. Go downstairs, use the office, set an alarm for 4 hours." "I don't need—" "Damien." She said his name the way she said things when she meant them without room for interpretation. 4 hours. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he picked up his jacket and left the library. She stayed in the window seat until the sky outside began to show the first gray edge of morning. She did not sleep, but she let herself be still, which was not the same thing and was sometimes more useful. The call came at 6:47 a.m. She heard it through the floor, heard Damien's voice from the office below, the specific change in register that she had learned to read as elevated urgency, 2 sentences and then silence and then footsteps on the stairs moving faster than she had ever heard him move. He came through the library door. She was already on her feet. "Carver," he said, "we have a location. He's mobile, moving in the next 2 hours. If we don't move in the next 30 minutes, we lose the window." "Go," she said. "You're staying here. Marco is on his way back." "Damien." She crossed the room to him. She stood close enough to see the specific tension in his jaw, the shadows under his eyes from the 4 hours of sleep she was not certain he'd actually taken. "Go. I'll be here when you get back." He looked at her. His hand came up and touched her face. The briefest contact, the back of 2 fingers against her cheekbone. The specific touch of someone who was allowing themselves one true thing before the door closed and everything became operational again. Then he was gone. She heard the front door. She heard vehicles outside. She sat down on the floor of the library, her back against the restored shelving, and she waited. She did not find out until later, much later, reconstructed from Marco's account and from what Damien told her himself in pieces over the following days, exactly what happened in the building on West 54th Street, where Carver had been running his operation out of a rented commercial space that looked from the outside like a private security consulting firm, because that was exactly what it was, in the same way that certain other things looked exactly like what they were as a form of camouflage. What she found out later was that there were 6 of them, that the location had 2 exits and both were covered, that Carver himself was not what she had pictured, not young, not theatrical, but a man in his early 50s with the nondescript quality of someone who had made a professional study of being forgettable, and who was sitting at a desk reviewing materials when Damien's people came through both doors simultaneously. What she found out later was that Carver, who was careful and professional and had survived 20 years in his particular line of work by being both of those things, looked at who had come through his door and made the assessment she had predicted, that completion was no longer worth the exposure, that the client was in federal custody, that the professional reputational cost of an open contract was less than the cost of the current situation, and made a decision accordingly. What she found out later was that the decision came with conditions, and that Damien had negotiated those conditions with the same contained, precise authority he brought to everything, and that what Carver ultimately provided in exchange for the resolution of the situation was something that would matter very much to federal investigators who had been building their case on Travis Holden's financial network for 14 months. What she found out in real time at 8:23 a.m. was a text from the secondary phone on the library floor beside her. "Done. Stay there. I'm coming back." She pressed the phone against her chest and sat on the library floor and breathed. He came back at 9:15 with a cut on his left forearm that he was minimizing with the specific practiced indifference of a man who had sustained injuries before and had a system for categorizing their significance. She saw it when he walked through the library door, and she crossed the room and took his arm in both hands and looked at it with the direct, unsentimental attention of someone assessing structural damage. "It needs cleaning," she said. "It's fine. It needs cleaning." She looked up at him. "Don't do the thing where you pretend your body isn't relevant." Something shifted in his face. He sat down on the window seat. He let her find the first aid kit in the office bathroom and bring it back, and he sat without moving while she cleaned the cut with the same focused, specific attention she brought to every physical problem that required her hands. "Carver," she said, "in federal custody by now." He cooperated, gave them 2 years of financial records connecting Travis's network to 4 other ongoing cases. A pause. "He'll do time. Less than he deserves, more than nothing. And his people?" "Dealt with." She focused on the cut. It was not deep. It would not scar, or would scar only faintly, the way the one on his jaw had scarred. Present, but not catastrophic. Evidence of something survived. "Are we done?" she said. "Is it actually done? Travis is in federal custody with recorded confession, financial fraud evidence, assault charges, and conspiracy charges. His attorney is already in discussions about a plea because the alternative is significantly worse." He paused. "The motion to review the settlement terms has been permanently withdrawn. Your divorce is final, as of the paperwork your attorney is filing this morning. He looked at her hands on his arm. Yes, it's done. She finished with the cut. She closed the first aid kit. She stayed where she was, sitting beside him on the window seat, close enough that their shoulders were touching, which neither of them addressed or moved away from. Outside the library windows, Manhattan continued in its enormous, indifferent, ceaseless way. Somewhere in the city, a federal detention facility was processing a man she had been married to for 7 years. Somewhere below them, the grand ballroom sat in its unrestored state, waiting, the way things with good bones always waited. The ballroom, she said. What about it? I want to finish it. After everything, I want to finish the whole building. He looked at her. Not for the project, she said. Not for the contract. I want to finish it because it deserves to be finished. Because it's been waiting since 1912 for someone to give it back to itself, and I want to be the one who does that. The contract doesn't cover the ballroom, he said. That was outside the original scope. I know. So you're proposing an extension. I'm proposing a decision, she said, about what this is and what it isn't, about whether the framing of this is still contractor and client, or whether it's something else now. He was very still beside her. The morning light was coming through the west windows, not the east-facing morning room light she loved, but a different kind, older, the light that came after a night that had cost something. I know what it is, he said. Then say it. He turned to look at her directly. The scar on his jaw caught the light the way it always did. His eyes were the specific dark she had spent weeks studying and filing under professional observation, and had never quite succeeded in making feel professional. I'm not good at this, he said. At the version of this that doesn't involve managing variables and assessing risk and making calculations about acceptable outcomes. That's the version I know. The other version, he stopped. I don't have a good track record with the other version. Neither do I, she said. My track record with the other version is objectively terrible. Something moved in his face. That thing, the thing she had never named but had always recognized. The ballroom, he said. Finish it. Take whatever time you need. Use whatever you find in the walls. A pause. The contract can be renegotiated. It can, she agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of someone who had been standing for a very long time and had found, finally, something solid enough to lean against without worrying about whether it would hold. He did not move. He did not speak. He sat with the absolute stillness that was his native state and let her be there. And that was, she thought, the most accurate translation available of the thing neither of them had said directly. Below them, the mansion breathed around them in its century-old way. The deposition was 3 weeks later. Evelyn sat across a conference table from 2 federal investigators and her attorney and gave 4 hours of testimony about Travis Holden, 7 years of it, assembled and organized with the same methodical attention she brought to every project that required understanding layers. The investigators were professional, focused, occasionally kind in the specific way of people who had heard many versions of this particular story and had not yet become indifferent to it. She was not performing calm this time. She was actually calm. There was a difference, and she could feel it in her own chest. The absence of the specific low-frequency tension that had been running through her since the diner, since the safe house, since the brake line, since the ballroom. Not gone entirely. She suspected it would not be entirely gone for some time, that certain rooms and certain qualities of light would catch her unexpectedly for months yet. But underneath the tension, there was something that had not been there in years. Ground. Her attorney walked her out after and said, on the sidewalk, "You did well in there." "I know," Evelyn said. Her attorney looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. "You've changed," he said. Not judgmentally, observationally. "Yes," she said, "I have." She took a cab to 83rd Street. Dawson. The work on the ballroom began in November. It was the most complex restoration in the building, the largest room, the most damaged, the most ambitious in its original design intent, and therefore the most demanding in its requirements for accurate recovery. Evelyn threw herself into it with the specific focused energy of someone who had been through a fire and come out the other side and needed to build something with her hands that was true and lasting, and entirely hers. She brought in the period craftsman from Queens for the plasterwork, a man named Enzo, who was 63 and had the hands of someone who had spent 4 decades in intimate conversation with old buildings, and who walked into the ballroom on his first morning and stood in the center of it for 3 full minutes without speaking before he said quietly, to no one in particular, "Madonna, look at what they did to you." She loved him immediately. The ballroom ceiling was the centerpiece, original plasterwork in a medallion design of extraordinary complexity, damaged in 3 sections by water and neglect, and the specific carelessness of previous owners who had installed modern lighting directly into the historic surface. Enzo worked on the ceiling while Evelyn worked on the floor, and they moved around each other with the practiced ease of people who understood that the building was the priority and their individual preferences were secondary to what it needed. Damien came more often now. Not every day, but his life was what it was. The empire he ran required his attention in ways that did not pause for personal developments. But he came often enough, and when he came, he would stand in the doorway of whatever room she was working in and watch for a few minutes before speaking, and she had stopped finding this unsettling and had started finding it something else. The word she was working toward was home, but she wasn't quite ready to say it yet. One Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of ballroom work, he came and stood in the doorway and looked at the ceiling progress and said, "It's going to be extraordinary." "It already is," she said. "We're just uncovering it." He looked at her. "That's what restoration is," she said. "It's not creating something. It's removing what shouldn't be there, so what was always there can be seen." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you think happened? With you?" She considered. "Partly." She looked at the ceiling, at Enzo's careful hands working the period plaster in the far corner. "Partly I think I built some things too, during, things I didn't have before." She looked at him. "You don't only lose things in a situation like that. Some of what you build to survive it, you get to keep." He crossed the room to her. He stood beside her and looked up at the ceiling with the expression she had come to know as his version of genuine feeling. Not performed, not demonstrated, but present in the specific quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved over something he was actually seeing. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The Foundation is planning to open the mansion as a landmark," he said. "Public access to the restored public rooms, permanent exhibition of the architectural history, the 1912 drawings and the journal." He paused. "They want to name the library." "The library is the building's best room," she said. "It should have a name." "They want to name it after the designer who restored it." She looked at him. "Your name," he said, "on the building, your work permanently documented and credited and visible, in a landmark that will be here long after both of us." She felt something move through her chest, large and warm and entirely genuine. She had spent 7 years with a man who had absorbed her work into his image of himself, who had taken credit in rooms she hadn't been invited into, who had told her quietly and consistently that her success was a product of his connections, his support, his willingness to make space for her talent. She had spent those years arguing with this version of events internally, while accepting it externally. The slow exhaustion of living in contradiction with your own knowledge of the truth. Her name on the building, her work, credited. Hers. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. "Yes." He nodded, and then, because he was Damien DeLuca and his expressions of feeling came through action rather than declaration, he reached out and took her right hand. The drawing hand, the one that carried the faint marks from the diner that were nearly invisible now, and held it. Not a romantic gesture. Not yet. Just a hand in a hand, in a room being slowly restored to what it had always been, the plaster drying overhead in the patient way of things that were being put right. She held on. The call came on a Tuesday. She was at her studio, her own studio, rented in January with the first payment from a new commission that had come through a preservation society that had heard about the mansion work. Her first project sourced entirely through her own reputation, through nothing that had Travis's fingerprints on it, or anyone else's. She was at her drafting table when her phone rang and the name on the screen was her attorney's. "The sentencing date has been set," he said. She set down her pencil. "Travis entered a plea," her attorney said. "The federal charges, combined with the state charges for the assault documented during the marriage, Combined with the conspiracy charges from the contractors, the plea agreement puts him at a minimum of 11 years. A pause. The Riverside property is yours. The financial settlement is reinstated at the original terms. There's nothing left to contest. She sat for a long moment with the phone in her hand. 11 years. She thought about a woman in a diner booth reorganizing a fork and a napkin and a coffee cup 4 times in 11 minutes because her hands needed something to do while she waited for the man who terrified her. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself, about what she deserved, about the size of the life available to her. "Thank you," she said to her attorney, "for all of it." She hung up. She sat at her drafting table in her own studio with her own commission on the board in front of her, and she pressed both hands flat on the surface, and she felt the solid, ordinary reality of it, the resistance of the table, the weight of her own palms, the fact of her own presence in a room that belonged to her. She picked up her phone and called Damien. He answered on the first ring. 11 years, she said. A silence. Then, "Are you all right?" "Yes." She thought about it. "Yes, I think I actually am." "I'm at the mansion," he said. "The ballroom plasterwork is finished. Enzo finished this morning." She was already reaching for her coat. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. She made it in 15 asur. The ballroom was extraordinary. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, the way she stood in every finished room and turned slowly, letting the space tell her whether she had gotten it right. The plasterwork ceiling was complete, restored to its 1912 design, the medallion pattern precise, the damaged sections invisibly repaired by Enzo's hands over 6 weeks of patient, meticulous work. The floors were refinished, the original oak grain visible and warm under the afternoon light. The windows were clean, the original hardware reinstalled, the room returned to itself so completely that it was difficult to remember what it had looked like, stripped and raw on the night of the gala, when 120 people had fled through the rear exits and a man in a holster had stood 8 feet from her ex-husband in the emergency lighting. The room held no trace of that night. The room was only what it had always been. Damien stood near the far wall, watching her turn in the center of the space. "Well?" he said. "Perfect," she said. "It's exactly right." He looked at the ceiling with the expression that was his version of satisfaction, contained, complete, requiring nothing external to confirm it. She walked to him. She stood in front of him in the restored ballroom in the afternoon light, and she looked at him the way she looked at finished rooms, with the specific directness of someone who has understood what they are seeing and is ready to say so. "I'm not afraid of your world," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend it's simple or that I'm comfortable with all of it, because that would be dishonest and you'd know I was lying, but I'm not afraid of it." "I know," he said, "and I'm not here because you protected me. I would have found my way out of Travis eventually. Maybe longer, maybe harder, but I would have gotten there." She held his gaze. "I'm here because of who you are when nobody's threatening anyone. The way you looked at the Harrington Library photographs. The way you listened to Enzo talk about the ceiling plasterwork for 40 minutes without checking your phone once. The way you told me the truth when it would have been easier not to." He was very still. "I'm here," she said, "because of who you are." The ballroom was quiet around them. 114 years of the building's history settled in the walls, in the plasterwork, in the oak floors that had carried other people's lives and would carry theirs. He raised his hand and touched her face, not the brief 2-finger contact from the night of the gala, but fully, his palm against her cheek, the gesture of a man who had decided that the calculation was made and the answer was worth the cost of having made it. "I've never been careful about anything the way I've been careful about you," he said. "I know," she said. "It showed." She leaned into his hand. Outside, the November afternoon was going cold, the light dropping fast over the Manhattan skyline, the city doing what it always did, enormous, relentless, producing the future whether anyone was ready for it or not. Inside the restored ballroom, in the building that had waited since 1912 to be understood, something that had been building since a rainy afternoon in a diner on West 46th Street was finally, without apology and without retreat, arriving at the place it had always been heading. Damien DeLuca, who had spent his entire adult life ensuring that nothing could get close enough to matter, stood in the room that the woman in front of him had given back to itself, and he let it matter. And Evelyn Rhodes, who had spent 7 years learning to make herself small enough to survive, stood in the finished ballroom of a mansion she had restored with her own hands and her own judgment and her own irreducible eye for what things were underneath what had been done to them. And she was, at last, entirely and only herself. The light held them both. The city moved outside. And somewhere in a federal detention facility across town, a man who had once told her she was nothing without him was beginning to understand, in the specific and permanent way of irreversible consequences, exactly how wrong he had been. The sentencing was on a Thursday in February. Evelyn did not attend. She had considered it, had turned the question over for 2 weeks the way she turned over structural problems, examining it from every angle, testing the load-bearing points. Her attorney had said it was her right. Margot had said she should go, that she deserved to see it, that witnessing the end of something was part of how you stopped carrying it. Damien had said nothing when she raised it, had simply looked at her with the particular quality of attention that meant he was letting her arrive at her own conclusion without his weight on the scale. She decided not to go. Not because she was afraid, not because she couldn't face it. She decided not to go because she had already been in the room with Travis Holden in the ballroom on the night of the gala, had already looked at him while the handcuffs were placed, had already felt the specific and permanent thing that had shifted in her chest when the federal agents walked him out. She had already had her moment of witnessing. She did not need the courthouse version. Instead, she was at the mansion at 9 a.m. when the sentencing was happening across town, standing in the ballroom with Enzo and 2 of his apprentices, overseeing the installation of the period light fixtures that had taken 11 weeks to source and reproduce accurately. She was holding a technical drawing and a cup of coffee and having a focused discussion with Enzo about the precise height of the central chandelier, and when her attorney called at 10:47, she stepped outside the ballroom into the corridor, answered it, listened, said thank you, and ended the call. She stood in the corridor for a moment. 11 years confirmed. All financial assets connected to the fraud case frozen and subject to federal forfeiture proceedings. The Riverside property formally transferred to her name by court order, retroactive to the original settlement terms. Every motion, every delay, every piece of legal machinery Travis had used to extend and complicate and exhaust, collapsed, finally, under the weight of what he had actually done. She put her phone in her pocket. She went back into the ballroom. "Problem?" Enzo said, looking at her over his reading glasses. "No," she said. "No problem." She looked up at the chandelier position, at the proportions, at the way the morning light moved across the restored plasterwork ceiling. 3 inches lower, she said. "It needs to sit inside the space rather than above it." Enzo considered this, tilted his head and said, "Yes, you're right." Which was, from Enzo, the highest available form of professional validation, and she accepted it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had earned it. But she told Damien that evening. He was in the mansion's second-floor office, the room he used when he was working from the building, which was more often now than it had been when the project started, a fact neither of them had formally acknowledged, but both of them understood. She came to the doorway the way he used to come to hers, and she leaned against the frame, and she said, 11 years. It's done." He looked up from whatever was in front of him on the desk. "Done," he said. "Done." He held her gaze for a moment, then he said, "How do you feel?" It was not a question he would have asked 3 months ago. 3 months ago, he had operated on the assumption, built from long habit, that feelings were private architecture, present, structural, not discussed unless the building was actively failing. She had changed that incrementally, the way you changed old plaster, not by force, but by consistent, patient attention to what was underneath. "Like something is over," she said. "And like that's not the same as everything being finished." She came into the room and sat in the chair across from him, the way she sat in it now when they talked, not as a client across a desk, but as a person in a room with another person, the furniture incidental. "There's going to be a day when I hear a sound or see a quality of light, or someone touches my wrist by accident and it'll all come back. That doesn't go away in February just because a judge said 11 years. Barmaj Gomanski dit bot. No, he said, it doesn't. I know you know that, she said. From your own version of it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the February dark had come down early the way it did in winter, the city lights coming on in sequence, the particular brightness of New York in February that was somehow both harsh and beautiful. My version of it is different, he said. I know. The things I carry, they're not things that were done to me. They're things I did. He said it with the flatness of someone who has made peace with a fact without making peace with the fact that peace is insufficient. That's a different weight. Yes, she said, it is. It doesn't... He stopped. Say it. He looked at her directly. It doesn't resolve. My version. There's no sentencing, no court order, no 11 years for the other party. The things I've done don't have an external ending. They just exist. And I carry them. A pause. I want you to know that I know that I'm not presenting you with a cleaned up version. The weight is real and it's permanent, and anyone who chooses to be near me is choosing to be near that weight as well. She looked at him across the desk in the office of the building she had spent 4 months restoring. She looked at the scar on his jaw and the shadows under his eyes, and the specific set of his shoulders that was the physical record of a life that had not been easy or clean or free of consequence. She had known all of this. She had known it since the diner, in some form, had been assembling it consciously since he had told her the truth about the reasons he'd been there, about the intelligence report, about the things he'd done that didn't resolve. I know, she said. I've known. She held his gaze. I'm not here because I think you're uncomplicated. I'm here because uncomplicated people don't sit in diner booths listening carefully enough to catch a threat in a language they don't have to understand, and then do something about it. He looked at her for a long moment. I was there for a different reason, he said. I've told you that. You were there for a different reason, she agreed, and you stayed for the right one. The office held the specific quiet of rooms where important things were said without performance. Outside, the city produced its constant, undifferentiated sound, traffic and wind, and the low-frequency hum of 8 million people moving through their particular lives with no awareness of this room or what was being decided in it. Damien stood up from the desk. He came around it and sat on the edge, closer to her chair, the desk behind him now, rather than between them. He reached out and took her hand. Not the brief contact of crisis or the careful touch of someone maintaining a boundary, the full, deliberate gesture of a man who had made a decision and was communicating it through his hands because the words were still being assembled. I want to ask you something, he said. She waited. The mansion, he said. When the public opening happens in the spring, the foundation is hosting an event. The formal landmark designation, the library naming, the public rooms opening for the first time. He looked at their hands. I want you there. Not as the designer, not professionally. He looked up. With me. She understood what he was asking. Not the event, not the logistics. The declaration embedded in it. Public. Together. His world and hers visible together in the same room, not managed or explained away or framed as professional arrangement. Yes, she said. He nodded. He turned her hand over in his, looked at the inside of her wrist. The place where Travis's grip had left marks that were entirely invisible now, gone under the skin, gone into the past where they belonged. He pressed his thumb gently against the pulse point. Not the way Travis had pressed. Nothing like that. The opposite of that. Not pressure, but contact. Not control, but awareness. The gesture of someone who knew what had happened there and was choosing to be the next thing to happen instead. She felt her pulse against his thumb. She let him feel it. The weeks between February and April were the quietest of any she could remember. She finished the ballroom. She finished the remaining rooms on the 3rd floor. She wrote the comprehensive restoration documentation that the landmark designation required. 47 pages of architectural history, material sourcing, decision rationale, and photographic record, the most thorough professional document she had ever produced, and the one she was most proud of, because every word of it was accurate and every decision in it had been genuinely hers. She started the new commission, a pre-war apartment building in Brooklyn whose owners had found her through the Preservation Society, who wanted their lobby and common spaces returned to their original 1930s design. She went to the building on a Tuesday morning and stood in the lobby for 6 minutes, running her hands along the walls, feeling what was underneath the decades of bad decisions. And she knew within those 6 minutes what the building needed and how long it would take and what the first step was. She rented a slightly larger studio. She hired an assistant, a recent architecture graduate named Priya, who had the combination of technical precision and genuine visual instincts that Evelyn had spent years looking for in junior staff and had never been able to find because Travis had always, for reasons she understood only retrospectively, managed to redirect her hiring decisions. Priya was 26 and direct and learned things faster than anyone Evelyn had worked with, and within 3 weeks, she was essential. She had dinner with Margot every Sunday. Margot had adjusted to the situation with the particular pragmatic grace of a person who loves someone enough to revise their concerns when the evidence requires it. She had met Damien twice, once at the mansion, once at a dinner that was technically casual, but that Margot had, Evelyn knew, approached as a comprehensive assessment. After the second meeting, Margot had said, walking home through the February cold, "He watches you the way someone watches something they've decided to spend a long time on." "Is that a compliment?" Evelyn had said. "From most people, no. From him, yes. He doesn't appear to commit his attention to things he doesn't take seriously." "He doesn't." Margot had been quiet for a block. Then, "He's still a complicated man." "Yes. And you're okay with that?" "I'm okay with real things," Evelyn said, "including the complicated parts. I've had enough of the clean version that turned out to be a lie." Margot had taken her arm. They had walked the rest of the way in the particular comfortable silence of 14 years of friendship, which needed nothing added to it. Marco came to see her in March. Not on duty, he came to the mansion on a Saturday morning when she was doing a final walkthrough of the 3rd floor, dressed in ordinary clothes, carrying a paper bag with 2 coffees the way he had carried coffees that morning outside her apartment building months ago. He handed her one. They stood in the 3rd floor hallway and drank them. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I've been with him for 12 years, Marco said. He said it the way he said most things, economically, without preamble. "I've watched a lot of people come near his life. There are categories. People who want something from him. People who are afraid of him. People who convince themselves they're not afraid of him, and then are, eventually." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "You're the first person I've seen who just looked at him straight, from the beginning, like he was a person rather than a situation." She looked at the 3rd floor hallway, at the restored wainscoting she'd spent a week researching, at the original light fixtures she'd sourced from an estate sale in Connecticut. "He is a person," she said. "I know that," Marco said. "I've always known it. I just wanted to tell you that someone else has been watching too, and that what I've seen, what's happened to him since the diner, it's real. Whatever you think is happening is actually happening." He paused. "He doesn't do things halfway. When he decides something matters, it matters absolutely. That's useful in his line of work." He looked at her. "It's useful in the other thing too." She thought about that. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He left the way he always left, without drama, without ceremony. The particular exit of a man who had delivered what he came to deliver and required nothing in return. She stood in the 3rd floor hallway for a long time after he left, holding her coffee and looking at the hallway she had helped return to itself. The spring opening was on an evening in late April when the air had finally decided to become genuinely warm rather than merely pretending to it, the kind of April evening that Manhattan produced occasionally as a form of apology for February and March. The foundation had done it properly. Invitations, lighting, a reception in the restored public rooms, a formal moment in the library where the landmark plaque was unveiled. Evelyn had seen the plaque design in advance and had approved it and had told herself she was not going to be moved by it, and was, when the moment arrived and the small crowd gathered in the library applauded, entirely and completely moved by it, her name on the wall, the room she had loved since the first morning. A century of good bones, finally visible. She did not cry. She breathed through it, which was better. Damien stood beside her during the unveiling. He did not take her hand in front of the crowd. That was not his style, and she would not have wanted it to be. But his shoulder was against hers, and the contact was solid and deliberate, and anyone paying attention understood what it communicated. Several people were paying attention. She found she did not mind. Later, after the formal reception, after the guests had moved through the public rooms, and the caterers had done their quiet, efficient work, and the foundation director had given a speech that was better than speeches. At these events usually were, later, after all of that, the mansion gradually emptied until it held only the people who belonged in it. Marco, at the front door, in his suit, with the particular expression of a man who was content with where he was. Priya, who had been invited because she had contributed 6 weeks of work to the final documentation and deserved to see it finished. Margot, who had worn something deliberately beautiful and stood in the morning room for a long time, running her hands along the restored wall surface with an expression of genuine appreciation that Evelyn stored carefully in memory. And Damien. He found her in the ballroom. She was standing in the center of the finished room, the way she'd stood when Enzo finished the plasterwork, turning slowly, checking it one final time with her professional eye. The chandelier was exactly right. The floor was exactly right. The windows, the hardware, the proportions of the restored room against the period light fixtures, exactly right. She felt him come into the room behind her. She finished her turn. He was holding his overcoat over one arm. The same quality of suit, the same controlled presence, the same scar on his jaw that caught the chandelier light, the way it had always caught whatever light was available, in the particular way of things that had been through something and didn't pretend otherwise. "Done?" he said. "Done," she said. He looked at the room. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at her. "The night of the gala," he said. "When it all came apart in here, I stood in this room and looked at what had happened to it, and I thought..." He stopped. "What did you think?" "That some things don't recover. That some damage is past the point where restoration is honest, where what you're doing is pretending rather than actually returning something to what it was." He looked at the plasterwork ceiling. "I was wrong." "You're not an architect," she said. "You wouldn't have known." "No." He looked back at her. "You would have." She held his gaze. "Take me to the roof," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and she followed him up the stairs, past the library with its named plaque, past the second-floor office, up the final flight to the roof access she had never used in 4 months of working in the building, through the door that Marco had unlocked earlier in the evening at no one's specific request, but with the particular foresight of a man who paid attention. The roof was unrestored, bare and simple, gravel and the basic infrastructure of a century-old building's top level. It offered no architectural drama of its own. It offered the skyline. Manhattan at night from a rooftop was not a subtle thing. It was enormous and lit and relentless, the city producing light in every direction, the shapes of buildings rising in their various decades and ambitions, the bridges in the distance visible as strings of light against dark water. It was the view that real estate agents described with superlatives and that residents learned to take for granted, and that, seen at the right moment, was genuinely and simply extraordinary. She stood at the edge, the safe edge, iron railing at waist height, the city below. And she looked at it. Damien stood beside her. The April air was warm enough to not need coats, but cool enough to make you feel it, and the wind up here was present and honest, and the city spread itself in every direction with its complete indifference to any individual life, and its complete inability to diminish the significance of any individual moment. "The diner," she said. "Yes." "You put your scarf around me. You said I was still shaking." "You were." She looked at the skyline. "I was shaking in that diner for about 4 years before you walked in," she said. "Somewhere around year 3, I stopped being able to feel it. It just became the baseline. The tremor you forget is a tremor because it's always there." She breathed in the April air. "I don't shake anymore." "No," he said. "You don't." "I don't think that's because of you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not because it diminishes what you did, Oz. It doesn't. None of it does. But the not shaking is mine. I did that." "I know," he said. "I've always known that." She believed him. She turned to look at him, at the profile she had been studying since a rainy afternoon, at the man who had set down an espresso cup and stood up in a diner because he heard something he didn't like and decided to do something about it, and who had been doing things he didn't have to do ever since, with the specific consistency of someone for whom integrity was not a performance, but a baseline, however complicated the surrounding architecture. "In the ballroom," she said. "When I said I was in it, I meant it then, and I mean it now." I know, he said, but I want to say it again, clearly. Not in the middle of a crisis or at the end of an argument or in a room where something just happened. She held his gaze. Here, on a roof. When there's nothing urgent, when there's no reason to say it except that it's true. She paused. I'm in it. He looked at her the way he had looked at the Harrington Library photographs, with the full, complete attention of someone who understood what they were seeing and was giving it the weight it deserved. So am I, he said. He unfolded the overcoat from his arm, the dark wool overcoat, the same quality as the scarf he had put around her shoulders in the diner on the afternoon when her life had changed, which she had returned to him and which had lived in his office at the mansion since then, present without comment, a fact without pressure. He settled it across her shoulders the way he had settled it on the day they met, careful, without performance, the gesture of someone for whom the action was the statement and needed nothing added. She pulled it around herself. It was warm with the warmth of carried things, of objects that have been close to a person for a long time and absorbed something of them. She stood inside it and looked at the skyline and felt the weight of it on her shoulders. Not heavy, not confining. The other kind of weight, the kind that steadied you. They stood on the rooftop of the building she had restored and he had brought back to life through her hands, and the city moved below them with its vast indifference and its incidental beauty, and neither of them spoke for a long time because there was nothing that needed to be said that was not already being communicated by the fact of both of them standing there, present, unafraid. She thought about this morning room, the east-facing light on the first day, her hand against the staircase banister, feeling the carving underneath the decades of paint. The 1912 journal in the wall, preserved by accident, surviving everything. The moment she had understood that restoration was not creation, but excavation, removing what shouldn't be there so what was always there could finally be seen. She thought about what was always there. She was still herself. This was what she had needed to know and had not known she needed to know until she was standing in a finished ballroom looking at her name on a wall. She was still Evelyn Rhodes, not the diminished version, not the carefully managed version, not the version that had organized itself around someone else's needs until it forgot what its own needs were. Still herself, with the added weight of what she had survived and the added precision of what she had built on the other side of it. Still herself. Exactly herself. That was the thing that had been restored. Not by Damien. She had said it and meant it. By her own hands, her own work, her own deliberate decision to keep going when keeping going was the harder choice. The morning room and the library and the ballroom and the 47-page documentation and the new commission in Brooklyn and the assistant named Priya and the Sunday dinners with Margot. All of it assembled and executed and chosen by her. She had done that. And she had done it standing next to a man who had looked at the actual work rather than the useful version of her, who had told her the truth when lying would have been easier, who had made mistakes and acknowledged them without drama, who carried permanent weight and said so plainly, and asked her to understand it rather than dismiss it, who had set down a coffee cup in a diner and stood up. The April wind moved across the rooftop. Below, the city went on. Damien turned his head and looked at her. "Marry me," he said. It was not the way proposals were supposed to happen. Not orchestrated, not prepared, not positioned in the lobby of a restaurant or the bow of a boat or any of the scenic locations designed to compel a yes before the question was fully heard. It was said on a rooftop in April in the direct, unadorned manner of a man who had decided that honest delivery was the only delivery he was capable of, and that if this was the moment, then this was the moment. She looked at him. She thought about the first time she'd seen his face in the diner. The quality of absolute stillness, the way he occupied space without requiring it. She thought about the library and the morning room and the safe house and the 48 hours of waiting and the cut on his forearm that she had cleaned in the window seat. She thought about 12 years in Marco's coffee, and I didn't know you said with the precision of someone who understood the difference between a name and a person. She thought about what she wanted her life to be. Not who she wanted to be with, she already knew that. What she wanted the life itself to be. Hers, first. Built on what she had excavated and what she had constructed and what she had earned. A life with room in it for someone else's complicated permanent weight, carried alongside her own, neither of them pretending the weight wasn't there. That was the life she wanted. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, a small sound, barely audible, the specific exhale of a man who does not show relief easily and has just felt it anyway. He raised his hand and touched her face the way he touched it now, fully, the palm against her cheek, the warmth of it specific and real. She leaned into it. They stood on the rooftop of the mansion on 83rd Street, with the city below them and the April night around them and the overcoat across her shoulders. And it was not a perfect moment. It was too cold and too real, and the rooftop was unromantically practical. And somewhere across the city, a man was beginning the first night of an 11-year sentence, and that fact did not disappear just because other things were true simultaneously. It was not a perfect moment. It was a true one. And the city below them went on as it always went on. Enormous, relentless, producing the future at the same rate regardless of what happened on any particular rooftop on any particular evening. Producing it without sentiment, without guarantee, without any interest in the individual lives moving through its intersections and its buildings and its rainy afternoons. But here was a woman who had reorganized everything on a table 4 times in 11 minutes because her hands needed something to do, and who was no longer the woman who needed that. And here was a man who had heard something he didn't like and stood up. And below them was a building that had been waiting since 1912 for someone to understand what it was. And the overcoat was warm, and the skyline held them both. And that was enough. That was finally and completely and without reservation, enough.